Hello everyone, today we talk about Islamic military music during the Middle Ages, which is a very different topic from the usual. I must say that, during historical education is rare to encounter such topics because we are often more concentrated on political, military, or social events, big macroscopic factors, the great systems of the universe that we try to decipher in some ways, but slowing down and taking a different approach sometimes that mostly spreads from anthropology as a perspective, or even the history of art, if you want to frame it. This is really not going to be about a video about music as such. We will mostly look at the various instruments that were used, but especially the political and military use of these instruments, but still talking about culture, broadly speaking, in a world that was dramatically complicated, just like it is today, in many ways, and that was extremely diverse, extremely different. Today we will essentially look at various, objectively at a wide area, both temporally and geographically, that however reveals you pretty clearly that the Islamic invasions actually, in spite of this initial wave that encompassed this enormous territory from the Atlantic to India, actually fragmented pretty soon, right? And they fragmented on the base of certain pre-existing bases of civilization. If you want to think about the major, you can see Mesopotamia or Egypt or Spain or Tunisia, etc. So areas that all had their own cultures, their own traditions, and into which Islam and its political and military culture was declined in two different ways. But still, there were certain, of course, common features that, in this contrast, start acquiring a very fascinating meaning, and we will be studying it through the use, more than the instrument themselves and the music in itself, by the use of military bands. Today we will talk essentially about the so-called tabla-khana, or nakkara-khana, or nakkara-khana, nawba-khana actually, which means literally the drum house, the cattle drum house, the military band house. I found this information chiefly on the Encyclopedia of the Islamic World. I think it's Brill Publishing, volume 10. It's actually plenty of very fascinating data that today we will, this is just a list of information. We'll try to criticize it because it reveals actually a lot, really a lot, even about those political, military, and social aspects that, we, historically speaking, we are more interested in broad terms, right? And this is a very important topic in itself. Not just because of what we will find that I personally found out, telling the truth, that I found very fascinating, but also for the relation that this world had with the West. Reading these things made me curious, actually, about a lot of things, even from the Western counterpart. Like, I rarely. Today we will talk essentially from the not just from the beginning of Islam, but also previous times. We will look even at from Hellenistic times, from the Parthians, but even talking about what the Arabs actually wrote about Hellenistic times from their own perspectives relatively to these topics, because that there is a huge amount of knowledge that the Muslims seized once they conquered the most Romanized areas, the Hellenized, if you want better, of Syria and Palestine, of Egypt. The Muslims had a very, especially the ones of the first, of the early invasions, had their leaders this idea that that was actually political propaganda and religious propaganda, that the true Muslim leader, the true expander of faith, with sword in hand, whatever, would read only the Quran, right? But we actually know by an extensive amount of evidence that these guys, as soon as they seized, I don't know, the Library of Alexandria, what was left of it, or maybe, they treasured Hellenistic knowledge in an enormous quantity, then in part actually was not even preserved by the Byzantines, and even less, of course, as you understand, by in Western Europe. And that actually tells us a lot, and I want to stress this, really a lot about Hellenistic history. Manuscripts that went lost throughout the course of Islamic history, but that the Islamic tradition had known and studied pretty thoroughly. The greatest hero of Islamic epics is, what do you think it is? It's Alexander the Great, right? Just like in the West, telling the truth. So it's interesting also looking at this, Christian and Muslim environments, studying, not talking about, just that there are co-religionaries as epics, in epical terms, but this hero of the ancient world, right? The Magus, the greatest commander, it was perceived at the time, and you find an astonishingly early Islamic tradition about the deeds of Alexander the Great up to Indonesia, Southeast Asia, that all cross, and in this traditions alongside with them there is a huge amount of information about even science, about, for example, the geysers. That there is all a tradition that show us basically that the early Muslims knew a freaking lot about what we miss today, about part of Hellenistic culture, and that they somehow absorbed and they acquired, and then they remain in past memory. So it's very interesting because, as we will see, especially about Alexander today, we will observe certain things that are amazing and are incredibly coherent with the political and military history of his empire through musical instruments. But also we will see, of course, what the Eastern perception of Western reality was, or at least in part. We will not talk much about that because actually there is not much here, but still realizing how it was like from the other side, when actually the West didn't have quite of a perception of this world, and vice versa in part, and also trying to dispel a bit of a myth that we have, which is a perception that I presume is shared by the Muslim and Christian worlds in historical perspective, that is essentially that I think we have a bit more in the West as a technologistic prejudice, right? That is that this attention towards musical instruments actually starts, at least here, I presume, because that's also how I kind of learned this thing, mostly from the late Middle Ages and especially early modern era onwards. I mean, the attention especially towards drums and their use in the military for keeping the steppe, etc. I even made a video about that, which is I think for an anthropology of discipline that talks about. I will check it out. Well, that's emphasizing, in fact, the development that in Western armies had existed. Here it is: death, trumpets, and drums. An anthropology of discipline, 16th to 18th century. It is about the development of early modern armies in Western warfare, to which musical instruments played an enormous role, as everybody who knows those times does, as all the maneuvers and steppe, in fact, all this order was regulated musically, right? And we have the impression that somehow, at least I had it, but by certain standards, and I keep believe that there is in some way, not really sure whether it can be proved otherwise, but I have my own suspicions about this, that fundamentally we don't have a huge deal of attention towards military music during the Western Middle Ages, during Christian Middle Ages, which instead is something I find extremely fascinating, that I found astonishingly frequently, at least in certain contexts, and especially the ones that are more interested in recreating, which are unfortunately few, and in sense of transmitting, let's say, those sources that care about transmitting the sensorial experiences of the battlefield, right? And that instead was extremely widespread at the time, right? If you study Western sources about Middle Ages, there is objectively a few references to musical instruments, or at least of the hundreds of books that I read in general, even about pretty generalist publications, etc. There is not a huge attention towards the acoustic dimension, right? There is these things, oh yes, that maybe the helmet reduced hearing and all this stuff, but when it comes to music, right, and even in medieval armies that, as you know, were largely non-professionals, or at least there wasn't this intense level of collective training that would become instead paramount in the development of Renaissance warfare. Still, music was a vital, important part of that world, and I don't see much attention about that, because it's as if music was eventually studied in that sense just for its strictly technological, functional, instrumental significance, and not for the deeper kind of moral, cultural, spiritual value that it had, and that it had in fact in Europe since ancient time. Thinking about the Karnics, thinking about all what the even the songs during the battle. Today we will look at that also, especially for pre-Islamic times, because these things existed and were actually much more widespread than what is supposed to be. And that's also why I made that video about death, trumpets, and drums, because even in what we see as the Renaissance, so the triumph of the evolution of the spread of reason and stuff, actually these instruments were still perceived as kind of a ghostly, demonic, spiritually sounding instruments for a function that went beyond a mere counting the step. The battle was a spiritual journey, and this is what we often forget. And it was like that before, right? We think from a highly secularized, modernized perspective that tends to simply ignore willingly, even when we're exposed to it, this a truly spiritual dimension. I can't find a better term, because that's essentially what it was, because it was all one with religion. And today we will talk about Islam, but this is actually present everywhere. Even medieval Islam and Christianity, of course, weren't perfect monotheisms, at least in the way they were actually spread in the beliefs that still people would consider themselves as Islamic or Christian actually would feel like. These were people that believed on a regular basis in astrology, for example, that believed in ghosts, in spirits that went beyond even of the local folklore, that where paganism was still alive, and in part, and this is also what creates those shades and different perspectives that that make this world richer and more interesting to study. But we will observe it now. So, this military band, this drum, the kettle drum, this term tabla-khan is the drum house. The nakkar is, as we will see now, the kettle drum, basically. So that already tells you how important the drum as such was in the sonority, in the acoustic of panorama, let's say, of certain worlds, especially these Middle Eastern ones, from since Achaemenid times, but also that can be seen as a steppes legacy, right? So the steppes had always had this great emphasis on the drum, right? All the Turkish traditions, for example, the Ottomans, as we will see now, maintained even very, very late in time, traditionally speaking. Even still, the modern Turkish army has this rituals attached to it that were something, in fact, deeper, that went beyond the same musical dimension, but into the spiritual one, and that poured, in fact, progressively into the Middle East, and eventually from there to the Near East, in the and fundamentally resounding, right, from this ancient steppes tradition. And having in Persia, especially, its main area of emanation all around, right? There's the Persian civilization is the fundamentally most important one that also would influence so heavily Islam, and especially the Abbasid Caliphate. It was at least nominally, the ecumenic power of Islam up to. And so these names are all they're basically defining they have multiple meanings. Actually, they could indicate the Islamic lens to the military band and its quarters in camp or town, right? So it's a concept that goes beyond the mere military band. It's mixed also with another one, the one of the tug, right? That especially amongst the early Turks was an emblem of royal authority. That could be in fact either a standard or a drum, right? And the thing here is a bit the same, because in for example in Western warfare you see that normally the banner was the rallying point on the battlefield, where you rarely hear about the acoustic dimension in there. In here instead, the acoustic was very important. The drum, more than the banner, was seen as and there is a reason, I suspect, for this also, because think of all these horses galloping around in this kind of semi-arid areas. Think of all the dust, the storm. So hearing sometimes could be even a real thing. But this was present even in Europe. I found it in battles that in 13th century Germany, where you find this major timpana were played like boom, boom, like that, and given the pace of troops when they were deploying, right? So never think that this dimension, especially from the steppes area, arriving up to in Central Europe, like in this case, hadn't had a common effect, right? Persians, Iranians are still Indo-Europeans, as and this is very important in the general picture and perspective, also of a mounted, of a cavalry and chivalric sometimes dimension, right? And so these are not just military bands, but also banners and or physical places in a city or in the military camp, right? That had, of course, their own sacred dimension, if you want, that was rendered sacred partly by music itself, whether it was pagan tradition like the initial Turkic one, or Islamic, or more often a hybrid of them, right? These were still the general meaning attributed to music. Like, consider that music, even in the West, think about the Musica by St. Augustine, that was one of the most extensively read. Augustine was what Western Europeans were largely read about during the early medieval times. It would become, even more than Vitruvius, the base for European architecture and for Gothic architecture, more specifically, because all those architectural proportions were reflecting the musical ones into this pure harmony that, of course, represented the divine one, the one of God Himself. So there were shared ideals towards music. Today we don't have time to study, to explain in depth how important, in fact, music was for monotheisms across Europe and Mediterranean and the near Middle East, right? But definitely this celestial character of it even transcended them. It was also, of course, a huge pagan legacy as well, and belonging to all the cultures that had lived up to that point, from the most developed to the most primitives, right? And these names, etymologically, are derived in turn from from certain instruments, chiefly from the drums, called as stable or nakkara, right, which formed the chief instruments of the military band, and from the name given to the special type of music known as nawba, performed by this band, that had a substantially military character, and with it also a consistently political and religious one, right? As in Islam, of course, the prerogative of power is and a military faculty is strongly tied to the caliphate, to the established power on this rule, that it is divinely acting, right, rather than operated by the local lords. As instead in Christianity it's more like that. Christianity has a greater empowerment to the local earthly rulers. In Islam it's the other way around. And therefore this is why possibly also music had this greater importance into the Islamic world, aside from the strictly ethnical cultural backgrounds that already knew these things, because also the power, this power is a faculty that is a kind of an upper level, right? But also there were also in fact different traditions a priori. And originally the so-called Nakkara-Khana or tabl-khana consisted of drums only, right? And in some instances of only particular kinds of drums. And we know this from several authors of the past. For example, Ibn Taghriberdi, died actually in the beginning of the 15th century, who speaks of the kettle drums that he names as dabadib. That would be the tabl-khana, in fact. Al-Zahiri died in the second half of the 15th century, that alludes instead to three sets, the ahmal of the tabl-khana and two trumpets. Ibn Iyas died at the beginning of the 16th century, that refers to the tabl-khana and the great kettle drums, the kusat. And as for the nawba, as we have said, this was a special piece of music, which later was to comprise several movements, the fusul, however it's said, performed by the Nakkara-Khana at the 5 hours of prayer. And this was a prerogative of royalty, and however it could be played also at the 3 obligatory hours of prayer by dignitaries of lesser rank as well. So what is interesting in this music is that you can even trace certain levels that correspond to political hierarchies that had the prerogatives of sounding, of playing them at a given, in certain given moments that, as you understand here, are strictly religious, right? So they have an important religious meaning by themselves, as purely as music. And the sounding of the nawba, in fact, was not only jealously guarded as one of the attributes of sovereignty, but its performance necessitated respectful silence from the auditors. There had to be no contamination of music. It was sacred music, in short, and the custom of the nawba is actually said into the Islamic tradition to have been handed down from the days of Alexander the Great. This is very important as well, because it makes you understand how even Islamic leadership and rulers considered in general Alexander as the great model, this great universal ruler that had marked most of the political and military events in their historical perspective, and set this practices, right? And of course the Muslims knew that Alexander was not a Muslim himself, so this is also the more important, because it sounds as if there was a transcendental celestial meaning attached to the music itself, but it was however convalidated also by the great rulers of the pre-Islamic era. So, and we have to make a step backwards in time to in fact fully understand how certain musical traditions had developed in the field of warfare. So instruments of percussion appear to have been specially favored by peoples of the Orient for their martial display from time immemorial. Starting from the classical age, the Greeks actually only used the trumpet and flute in war, right? The instrument of percussion belonged to the barbarians, to them, right? So This is very interesting because of many reasons that we'll explain better in a while, but this already makes you understand in terms of not much of musical but also military culture a lot of things. There are different rhythms that pertain to the Hellenic classical warfare that were different from the one of the barbarians. They were largely tribesmen, but not only, of course. Think about the Achaemenids. They were even more advanced as a political and military culture to the Greeks. Yet, and this is the interesting thing, in the Syriac version of the Pseudo-Callisthenes of the history of Alexander the Great, we find that the world conqueror Alexander added drums to his martial music, right? This is interesting because if we turn, for example, to the pseudo-Aristotelian Arabic treatise, the Kitab al-Siyasa, that was written between the pretty early, between the 8th and the 9th century, and also the contemporary works of Muristus, also in Arabic, it would seem that Alexander also introduced a monster organ, the organon. So the organon, where you see even etymologically speaking, it's the same Greek one, of the Draulis type, right? As a means of signaling to his troops and to spread dismay in the ranks of the enemy. This is very fascinating for several reasons. The first one is that there is evidently a passage in Alexander's time from classical to Hellenistic culture, right? So we haven't been talking about this on Schwerpunkt a lot, but to make it simple, there was objectively a real shift in terms of military culture as well. As you know, the Hellenic hoplitic phalanx is something very different from the Hellenistic Macedonian phalanx, right? The first one is an unprofessional city militia that has this materialism as the same foundation, with the usual exception of the Spartans, into the despise, the contempt towards military life, because that belongs to the barbarians. Just the barbarians that just make war all the time. The rest of the Greeks, except the Spartans, basically went to war. War was considered as ineliminable, but they didn't like it. They did it just because they had to do it, because complicated reasons we can explain the fact that the Hellenic polis had developed against the older aristocracies of the Hellenic Middle Ages, and that were mounted, and also this kind of obscured partly what is believed to have been actually a much more widespread use of cavalry into Hellenic times, excuse me. But definitely in Hellenistic times there is a big change. Alexander the Great invades Asia with this military instrument that his father had forged for that specific purpose, that had evolved fundamentally conceptually from the Hellenic classical phalanx into this pikemen, fundamentally, that were very different from a political and social point of view in their background, but also that fought, in fact, in a different way. The Sarissa requires a much greater training that could be imposed just to these professional troops that, in fact, could perform maneuvers and coordinating arms in a way that, in fact, the Greeks had never known before. And therefore, the Macedons here needed certain instruments to coordinate all these movements and these maneuvers, and the instrument that was used, and is the best one in this sense, is the drum, because it has this kind of sense of the incumbent, this rhythm advance that requires a firm step, a certain particular cadence that without which the formation can of course split in parts, and that is part of the same training and of course of the same combat, right? And this is the same thing you find actually in the 15th century in Europe, where the Swiss evolve fundamentally in the same, still in a different way, but still also developing this pike infantry that in medieval times had never quite reached professional levels, and with these blocks of thousands of men who had all to march in step and perform somewhat complex maneuvers, all together with perfect geometrical precision, etc., upon which was based all the effectiveness of that formation. And that's when, in fact, drums in Swiss warfare are particularly, evidently developing, right? In that sense, and as they will remain into up to rifled arms, basically, because that was the deal. As long as formations had to stick together and into professional armies to perform those maneuvers when the battlefield was full with full formations, right? With the rifle guns, and eventually, especially with repetition automatic machine guns, soldiers scattered. So the problem wasn't quite the same, even though there were still musical instruments that could be used even to boost morale, but it's kind of another story. So here the shift from the Hellenic tradition of warfare still used trumpet and flutes, right? The trumpet is also very fascinating because the trumpet is somewhat emphasizing this aggressive, immediate attack, right? It could be maybe one of the last meters of the two hoplitic phalanxes clashing, but it's more immediate. It's this idea of launching yourself. With a Macedonian phalanx, you don't do that. You just need a drum that coordinates very well the step, and therefore, in all this hints, we have the of course, the surpassing of what the Hellenic mindset at the time considered to be as the perfect culture into the Hellenistic, and somewhat, in the case of Alexander, mixed with what the Hellenes would have called as barbarian military culture. That included the drum, and even here, from the Arab tradition, a pretty early Arab tradition, the one of Moristus, here we find a monster organ that was a hydraulic organ was used to signal troops and even to scare the enemy, which is also important. And this is a function that in other armies was at least was deputed to other instruments, like the timpana, for example. We will see it now. So Strabo in the 1st century BC says that the youth of Persia were called to arms by the sound of brazen instruments, and that the kings of India moved in public to the din of drums and cymbals, right? So these cultures were recognized, of course, to be already, marked by these forms of musical, martial tradition. And Plutarch, writing around the 20s of the 2nd century AD, speaks of the Parthians using kettle drums to frighten the enemy, right? And this is true because actually we know that it was the case. Think about the Battle of Carrhae, where when Surena started playing this drum, this big drums, actually to scare the Romans, and all the valley echoed with this terrible sound that they are objectively terrifying. Never underestimate, in fact, the acoustic dimension of warfare, right? At one point it's covered just by firearms and explosions, etc. But in this time it wasn't the case, and these sounds were truly some of the scariest things you could ever hear, right? Aside from thunders and stuff, and they were meant partly to replicate, in fact, as natural sounds, but they could be imposing, really, and shattering, right? So never underestimate that, psychologically speaking. In the Shahnameh, as you know, is one of the most famous Persian epics. Firdavsi died in the beginning of the 11th century. There are abundant details of the military music of Persia of old, right? These were traditions that dated back in the millennia, and here we can read the name of instruments, for example, as the horn, and trumpet type, the karranai, the shaipur, the book, the reed, and a brazen pipe, the nai, ruvin nai, the drum and the great kettle drum, the tabira and the kus, as well as the Indian bell, sonnet, and cymbal, hindi, darai, zang, sindhi, right? So talking about pre-Islamic times. There would be actually a lot to discuss about the Parthian military culture and the Sasanian times as well, but talking about the Arabs of the Jahiliyyah. Clement of Alexandria, in the 2nd century AD, states that the Arabs of Arabia, in fact, broadly meant, not just the ones of the Umayyads, but I think generally, broadly speaking, used symbols in war, in his pedagogus. But Arabic authors only mention the tambourine, actually, the so-called duf. And also, very interestingly, the matrons and singing girls, the kiyan, right, in battle, right? And this is very interesting because you know that pre-Islamic warfare in Arabia was mostly you know, about caravan raiding, right? It was a mounted warfare, had a great importance into the smaller and the most habitual operations along this area that naturally requires swift moves because, you know, the climatic necessity, the environmental necessities, etc. But when we look at battles like pitched battles with, you know, substantial armies, we notice that in fact Arabic armies were pretty much centered on infantry, right? I made a video about early Arab tactics in which we realized that was all an evolution towards cavalry, especially during the early Islamic invasions when the Arabs went out of Arabia proper. But you can say that pre-Islamic warfare in Arabia was largely still, of course, tribal, but especially in this sense, seasonal and ritualized, right? And the participation of even women into this role of singers, right, of inspirers, of chanters, I don't know how to define them, was, you know, all one with the martial element. It naturally symbolized the presence of this clans in their demic sense, you know, this even female elements that sang along the warriors. Is you know, that inside them, some similar things existed. I don't know, among the tribes of Europe. Thinking about the Germans, did kind of the same things. And these songs weren't just songs like all others. Were obviously spells. There were poetry. They sang about the ancestors. That had a magic value, right? That they had a propitiatory function, apotropaic function, and they boosted morale of the army. And this is what we see at Uhud and Badr, for example. At least, although it is highly probable that the red pipe, the so-called mizmar, was also an instrument of martial music in this days. And there is a very highly imaginative Turkish writer, died actually in the second half of the 17th century, so of course more than 1,000 years later, Evilia Celebi, who avers that in the time of Muhammad it was neither the trumpet nor the flute that sounded in his wars, but only the great kettle drum. This could mean actually from a Turkish perspective, in this sense that, you know, it was an of course the later Muslims were so influenced by other musical traditions that even in their historical perception they decided to flank the, you know, the time of the Prophet with the presence of kettle drum that had become an ethnic kind of national musical instrument, like it was the case, in fact, of the Ottomans, right? In this case. On the other hand, Ibn Khaldun, very famous scholar, he died in the beginning of the 15th century, states that early Muslims used neither horns, the habwak, nor the drums, the tubu. And it is certain that although the Arabs used the horn in civil life, this was not a military instrument, since it is specially mentioned in the 9th century as being used by the Christians. So this is important because it also characterizes in here the Christians as hornblowers in their armies, and here we're talking chiefly about the Byzantines, like in the 9th century. That's fundamentally what the major the major foe that the Muslims were meeting at that point. And it is realistic, telling you the truth, and this indirectly can work as a hint for saying that the horn was not used, at least as a military instrument, by the Muslims at that time. So, passing to Umayyad and Abbasid times, so at the full affirmation of the Caliphate and the Golden Age of Islam. So, under the Umayyads, the drum and the kettle drum appear to have been introduced into martial music and served as better accompaniments to the reed pipe than the tambourine, as we've seen they had been used. So this obviously derives from the strong Persian influences which asserted themselves under the early Abbasids, leading to the Persian reed pipe, the Songhai, being adopted in place of the more primitive mizmar. By the 10th century, several types of kettle drums were already used in martial array into Muslim armies. For example, the tabl al-markab, or mounted drum, which was probably identical to the dab or daba and the nakkara, and a larger type, the great kettle drum called the kus. These were used in pairs normally and were carried on either side of a horse's or camel's neck. What is interesting about it is that we have evidence, especially from Turkic warfare, that began to be known to the Muslims, since this is the moment in which the ghulams start spreading into the caliphate armies. Is that these drums were actually not the prerogative just of tambourines or a specific group of soldiers, but actually of most cavalrymen, right? So that you would say, but where did they carry? Well, some of them were very small, right? And it was possible perfectly to use them, and then eventually pass to the sword when you had to engage into melee, right? So think of what this means, having sometimes thousands of horsemen playing all together a drum before a charge, for example, or even during a charge. So increasing tension and adrenaline to the unbelievable, right? And spreading fear into the heart of the enemy, and still boosting your own morale. So naturally this was done by either side, but this is seemingly in fact the legacy not just of Persia now, but also of the steppes, whose warriors are pouring in fact abundantly into the Muslim ranks, and that bring with them this peculiar military culture. The book or horn had also been adopted into Islamic military music by this time. And although originally fashioned out of the natural horn of an animal like the more primitive Khan, it came to be made in metal. And in the 17th century, Celebi says that the metal form, the so-called Pirinjiburu, I presume it's pronounced, was introduced by the Seljuk Alp-Aslan, right? Which is also like a bit of invention probably from this side. Now, Alp-Arslan, as you know, we made a 3 hours and a half video about the Battle of Manzikert. We know the importance he had in political military affairs of the 11th century. He was a great commander. Might as well be that he introduced this metal form of the horn, but it sounds a bit like Ottoman sources of the modern era kind of boasting this, because it was a Turkic thing, right? But it's probably true. Maybe it was not Alp Arslan himself who introduced it, but it seemingly it had effectively spread at this point into Muslim armies. The trumpet proper was called the nafir, and this was first known as the book al-nafir, which literally means the military book, right? So specifically that a war trumpet. So passing to the age of crisis of the caliphate, right? So, and which is very important because here starts diversifying things and also regulating increasingly these formalities, including military music, and that's where it gets, in my opinion, ever more interesting, because up to the let's say the 10th century, the Nakkara-Khana or tabla-khana, which by this time, as we've seen, now comprised kettle drums, trumpets, horns, reed pipes, was part of the insignia, the maratip of the caliph himself, right? So this had become a status symbol that within the same Islamic hierarchy of power, and it was reserved, in fact, as itself, together with the nawba, so with the particular martial music, for the commander of the faithful alone. This is what Ibn Khaldun says. Now, this is very important because you understand that music now has reached a very important practical level, right? Here, Muslim armies have passed from their Islamic, let's say pre-Islamic, tribal, seasonal, and professional militias to, in fact, permanent professional armies of a state with a bureaucracy, etc. So music in parallel has stratified accordingly at the point that the command of music itself, this military music itself, right, was the prerogative of the caliph himself, who could dispense, right, of the right to use the Nakkara-Khan, tabla-Khan, so this military bands. This is the most important thing we'll deepen now. So with the decline of the caliphate, instead, and the rise of petty rulers, there was the demand to kind of spread all this prerogative, always from the source of the caliph, as a privilege, right? Only a few leaders were worthy of the Nakkara-Khana and the nawba, right? Thus, the custom arose that when the caliph conferred regality on subject rulers, a drum or kettle drum was usually accompanied to the other patents or symbols of authority sent by the caliph, right? It could be a diploma, a banner, as we said, the tug before, or a standard. But sometimes they were all one, conceptually speaking. Of course, there was a composite nature of them. This is where you get, in fact, in this immense caliphate, spatially speaking, so many different communities, but also military traditions, even of outsiders that all have also their own symbols of power, right? We talked about the Turks before, that at this point came from a world that was obviously not Muslim yet, and that are progressively converting. So, and you can see in Turkic military culture this sum of Islamic elements from one other and pagan from the others. The Turks, even those converted to Sunni Islam, kept drinking alcohol largely, for example. But there are so many characters that you can spot quite easily, especially given that these guys are pouring in a moment in which the same caliphal authority is decreasing. So effectively they start settling and becoming a power on their own, even as, without, obviously with a great cultural, with a great influence deriving from the caliphate itself and from other cultures, chiefly the Persian one that had been so important even to characterize the Abbasid Caliphate of Baghdad, that was heavily Persified as much as the Turks now that arrived there as well. But the whole concept is that this symbol of power is all one. It includes music as well, the faculty of playing this, the nawba, particularly the military music of Islam. So there could be this also could there was all a segmentation in this. For example, even the type of instrument or the number or even the specific use of the nawba in different styles and different forms was determined by the rank of the recipient. So you can imagine the complexity also of this all, and even at a strictly military level, being able to recognize a certain power from the peculiar type of nawba that at this time was surely differentiating in some form by this regard. And this was particularly important, I presume, also because not just as a symbol, as a formality, but because objectively the same military instruments were effectively more important in the battlefield. Like having more instruments could make a louder sound, so being more powerful and having the recognition. So even this aspect was could help us measure the political game that was occurring here. That the smaller powers would reflect in their military music their lesser power. While the greater ones would boast this the same according to their rank, right? Muiz al-Dawla in 900 died in 967. Was the Buvayyid Amir sought for the Caliph al-Muti the privilege of the Nakkara-Khana, but it was refused to him, for example. Yet, in 966, the year before, the Caliph allowed a commander to sound kettle drums, the Dabadib, during a campaign, an honor which the latter appears to have retained eventually. It is said, and this could be related even to the actual, in fact, material possession of the instrument, because once you gave it to them, probably was difficult to get it back. Of course, they could even build another one by their own, but we're still probably a peculiar. You can imagine even an artisanal handcraft that they mention of this that rendered sometimes more prestigious and others more evidently counterfeited to determine if you really were invested of such an honor. It is said that the first prince to obtain this coveted musical honors, however, was the Amir Adud al-Dawla, died 983, so there is a bit of debate here whether what came first or came not. This could reflect, in fact, part of the same hierarchy of these instruments and types of music, awarded to maybe a greater leader that made which echoed more than others. However, Adud al-Dawla was granted the Nakkara-Khana by the Caliph al-Tahi in 979, but he was only allowed the threefold nawba at the obligatory hours of prayer, the fivefold nawba being reserved for the caliph, right? So that's, of course, an evident hierarchy involved. In one of the Buvayids, there are these rulers of the crisis of the Abbasid Caliphate. Abu Khalidjar died in the mid-11th century, assumed the fivefold honor in Baghdad at one point, and although asked by the Caliph to content himself with the threefold one, he refused. Right, so these are the moments in which, objectively, the power of the Caliph of Baghdad himself had shrunk at the point that even his protectors / kidnappers could exercise this faculty of disposing of the Nakkara-Khan and the nawba themselves. Yet, the Caliph had already permitted others to have or assume this privilege. For example, in the year 1000, here I'm using, of course, the Christian timeline, because there would be like year the month in Islam 390, something like that. Under the Caliph Al-Qadir, a minister that was allowed to beat a drum, the tabl, for the five-fold nawba. And as well as in 1017, Sultan al-Dawla was allowed or had assumed a similar honor. Talking about the Seljuks. Now, considerable extensions of the privileges of the Nakkara-Khana were made under these rulers that, as you know, came to hegemonize, even it's a big word, but let's say to control a very vast area of the Middle and Near East, and detaining effectively caliphal power on behalf. Like, they were formerly the protectors of the Caliph of Baghdad, and however their arm, let's say, and they, however, soon also never quite reached the unity of a concrete empire. They were kind of a whole series of princely powers that kind of went on fragmenting, especially towards the end of the 11th century. So the Abbasid Caliph Al-Muqtadi, in appointing a governor to a province, conferred the great kettle drums, the kusat, on him, with permission to sound the five-old nawba within his province, but only the threefold one outside of this. Now, this is also interesting. There is a spatial dimension where you can sound, right, your own. If it is in your district, in your province, you can extend. That is a recognition of power, right? There are similar things you can find in other dimensions within the same Islamic world, but it's a bit like what was happening in Europe into the incipient feudalism. That certain privileges like the allodiya were recognized as full property, even that not even the king could touch, right? Not even the emperor could touch. And here it's the same. The caliph is telling you, okay, in your province you can use the five-fold nawba. That is basically the recognition of an equal level, at least, of caliphal power, but outside of it, just the 3-1, right, conventionally. So this is very interesting. And when the two Seljuk princes Berk Yaruk and Muhammad took the titles of Sultan and Malik respectively in 1101, they adopted the five-fold and three-fold nawba with these respective ranks. Now this is very important. You know that the Sultan is a greater title than the Malik, in fact, right? The Sultan has a The Sultan is a debated title. It was, however, covered by some of the most powerful dynasties of Islam. It's just a step behind the Caliphate, right? It's a kind of a more regional scale power. The Malik is a kind of a petty ruler, right? Sort of king. Also, in Islam, the term Malik in itself has kind of a negative exception because it sounds like more an earthly power that the Sharia that despises. As such, but it's extremely meaningful here that the rank was equated now. Like the five-fold nawba now was equated to the Sultanate as it had been to the Caliphate at one point, and here the Malik had the threefold one and kind of a emiral-like power as well. So it's very fascinating. And both Alp Arslan and the Eldig Guzid Kizil Arslan in 1191 used the five-fold honor. Now it's also very interesting that this honor of the nawba was awarded to self-award, I'll say better, to certain sovereigns in the Islamic world in pairs. This is particularly interesting because it shows the completion in some way of this, the fulfillment of this political unity that passed also through the musical one. So the threefold and the fivefold nawba were prerogatives that had to be somewhat covered by someone at a given point. It's as if it was a magistracy, right? But still with a kind of less secularized meaning. So, in talking about other dimensions, strictly about Arabia, for example, and we extend a little bit the picture. In Yemen, for example, during the 9th century, the Karmati al-Mansur Hazan had 30 drums, the two bulls, while the Sayyid al-Val of the Najahids had horns, the bukat, and drums as well. Later on, we read of the tabul-khana and the great kettle drums nakkara. So it's as if the structuration of these powers could be measured through the extension of the range and the number of musical instruments that were available. At Zufar in Oman, in the 14th century, the Sultan had reed pipes, the surnayat, the horns, the bukat, and the trumpets, the hanfar, as well as the drums, the two bull at his gate. This is particularly important because here it requires even a kind of local, I can say, princely dimension, even in the citizen space, like in the settlement at the gate of the centers. Of Zafar, and at Al-Hilla, the military music instead consisted of horns, trumpets, and drums. At the beginning of the 11th century, the Umayyads favored the horn and the kettle drum in their martial music, whilst elsewhere we find a small shallow kettle drum called the kas'a in use. So you realize here in the Arabian Peninsula how every local power had kind of its own traditions, its own even different names, and plausibly also different musical and cultural differences and influxes from other cultures surrounding. The Arabic Peninsula is a pretty diverse thing, as well as a pretty large one, and spanning from very close to Persia from one side and to Africa from the other, right? So the sounds, even the landscapes, the cultures do change, do vary, and this is reflected even in military music. In the most famous Alf Layla Va Layla, that is the 1,000 nights and one night, right? So the Arabic title for the world famous collection of tales known in English as the Arabian Nights. You find actually the most imposing martial music display being made up by reed pipes, the zumur, the horns, the trumpets, the drums, and the cymbals. Passing to Egypt, we can't avoid to talk about the Fatimids. I also made a video recently about the Fatimid Caliphate as an introduction. And the Fatimids, as you know, they were a Shia caliphate that at one point came to challenge and to threaten pretty concretely the same Abbasid Sunni overlordship on Islam, right? So part of their competition with the caliphs of Baghdad was represented by the prerogative of dispensing musical honors upon subject rulers on very much the same lines as the Abbasid caliphs, right? So it was literally the same thing. When the Amir al-Aziz in 996 marched into Syria, he had 500 horns, abwak sounding. And Nasiri Khusraw describes the Fatimid military band, for example, in the mid-11th century, and he mentioned that it comprised such instruments as the horn, the reed pipe, two kinds of drum, and the latter, especially a Persian variety, known as, in fact, tabl and duhul. Also cattle drums, like kus in the symbol, the kaza, right? And while in the year 1172, when Nur-al-Din and Salah al-Din were together at Damascus, the former, who was the suzerain of the latter, sounded the five-fold nawba, whilst the latter contented himself with a threefold one, right? So the same hierarchy that we have seen before. The Nur-al-Din having the prerogative of the five-fold nawba, and Salah ad-Din the threefold one, right? As a form of submission. Under the Mamluk sultans, the military band of Egypt was organized on more elaborate lines, and similar to the practice in Iraq and Maghreb, it was linked up with the banners, standards, and similar emblems of authority, as Ibn Iyas informs us. And according to Al-Zahiri, the band of Sultan Baybar I in 1277 comprised 40 great kettle drums, 4 drums, 4 reed pipes, and 20 trumpets. The source says that the duhul and the zumur were of recent adoption, but we have seen them also in use under the Fatimids, since the zamr and the surna were both reed pipes. And Ibn Taghribirdi says that under Kalavun in 1290, Abbasir possessed a tabl-khana, and we read of a similar privilege in 1418, although we are told that the custom was not usual. So here Abbasir could own kind of a tabl-khana on its own within the same Mamluk power, that sultanate, that in as you know, it was the major power of the area at the time, North Africa and the Near East, albeit it also suffered kind of a privatization of political power, so that even though there were sultans, were equally very important, and even semi-independent powers that vassals, let's put it in this way, that could develop on provincial scale power on its own, that could in fact institute a military band on the tabl-khana model, right? But it was still unusual, a proof that this was a custom destined to at least the most powerful rulers that could, still decide whether to dispense it or not, wherever their power reached. Ibn Khaldun states that the great cattle drums were allowed to each Amir in general, yet according to Ibn Taghribirdi, it was only the Umara commanding 1,000 men who were granted this honor. So this means that certain instruments, at least, however, had been spread, at least to this strictly military figures, right, that had to be technically part of the, under the command of the Sultan, being a sort of a small tabl-khana on its own regard, right? So this is interesting because it's as if the sacral value of the tabl-khana in Mamluk Egypt, at least, was somewhat, separated, broken down into kind of smaller bands, and an Amir band, an Amir tabl-khana, is said by Al-Zahiri to have owned the drum, or the duhul in the number of two, the reed pipe or zamr in the number of 2, and the trumpet or nafir in number of 4, albeit not the great kettle drum that was, in fact, the most imposing instrument that was not allowed evidently. An atabak was allowed twice this number, though, whilst an Amir Mukaddam was only permitted to have a horn or bak alone, right? By the 15th century, however, an emir of 40 cavaliers was permitted to possess a tabul-khana himself, but for a time he was only allowed to sound it when on duty. So this is also interesting because it reveals as if this military band or instruments were were assuming a kind of a more secularized function of strictly, in fact, military instruments for war, right? So that they could be given together with the band, not much as a recognition of power, but like in exchange for a military for carrying out that same military service and nothing else, right? When the Ottomans conquered Egypt in 1517, the Mamluk bands of the Umara were suppressed, and this is also very important because it means that the Ottoman rule didn't accept any competing power in that regard. So this was, even though, as we know, the Mamluks would maintain actually pretty, large autonomy in Ottoman Egypt, still this prerogative of the Umara bands, at least, were suppressed. Passing to North Africa, the Maghreb. So Ibn Khaldun, once again, very important source, says that the nomadic Arabs of North Africa employed an improvisator known as the Munshid, who sang at the head of the troops just as the Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula did in the Jahiliyyah times. Now, this is very important because it reveals, in fact, a North African culture that is characterized mostly like kind of a Bedouin tribal society, resemblant of the Arab one, that still existed, by the way, in spite of the spread of Islam in many other places. And this is true. Objectively, the Muslims of the Mashrek had this kind of negative perception of the Maghreb, as an area of half Islamization, where the pagan background was still somewhat alive. Even the evil magician of the Islamic point, usually he comes from the Maghreb, and there is this kind of negative, dark stigma attached to it. And objectively, North Africa, aside from Egypt, that still pertains, in fact, more to the to the Mashrek area, culturally speaking, as more civilized. Where it's just a stripe of land where the hinterland is semi-desertic and inhabited by peoples that have still a kind of a tribal lifestyle, right? And that did resemble, in terms of political and military and social development, the early Arabs. So this improvisator, as the Munshid, was similar to even those, broadly to those singing women in the pre-Islamic Arab armies, and he would naturally sing at the head of the troops, like as a form of incitation, but also probably with a magic purpose, and singing particular things, not just pop songs. That this was still a highly, in fact, religiously imbued world where even this Islamic and pagan beliefs would maintain it, but the pride of the local tribe, the local clans, was still pretty solid. But there was no need for a military band, more developed, like you could find in the most developed Islamic areas. And you can't even imagine in here the heterogeneity that even this music presented, and the problems that ensued as a consequence when a local Islamic power would like to impose the control on all of them. So this would pass through constant interesting warfare. You can if you study the region of North Africa, even in early modern times, when you find that the inherent political and military instability of those areas, right? The relation even of the local Islamic rulers was much more confidential, informal, than, of course, instead the highly structured and sophisticated etiquette that you could find into, I don't know, the Sublime Gate of Constantinople. So it's very interesting to observe this area, and especially to see also those moments in which this culture expanded elsewhere. In the Middle Ages, for example, it's the case of the Almohads, that at one point, reaching the power they did, even settling in Spain, forming a new power that collapsed shortly afterwards, but anyhow was temporarily very, very strong. The first thing they do, this dynasty does, is to suppress the bans used by local governors and reserving the use of the tabul-khana for royalty alone. And it's interesting because the Almohads, even as in terms of political culture, given the same etymology of their name, means the Unitarians, the witness of the unicity of God, right? So probably this suppression of local tabul-khanas, we wanted to stress exactly this. Having come from the Moroccan Atlas and having had to deal historically all of this fragmentation, now they instated finally that at least the tabul-khana now could be only in their own service as a dynasty, and probably the thing split afterwards because of the political events that we know, but it's still very meaningful. And the Almohad tabul-khana was formed into a separate company with the standards, the bunud, which became known as the Saka. And the first Almohad Sultan, Abd al-Mumin, died in 1163, had more than 200 drums, the tubuls, and among them were such large instruments that the ground quaked, allegedly, when they were played, right? Which is pretty realistic, telling the truth. Which was objectively a big number. The Marinids later also possessed a large drum of this type, and this passed into the possession of the Salian dynasty eventually. And this was an enormous instrument that could be heard at a very long distance, and it's impressive. Think about just from communication, even not just in the battle, but thinking all this coordination. Even instead of using a bell like we built in church towers, this could be a thing. As we have seen, it was also played during the hours of prayer, right? So it was a way to communicate as well. And you can imagine on the battlefield how useful it was, right? It was said that when these drums stopped playing, the command on the battlefield was in trouble, because this is where the drums were kept, and if you didn't hear them playing anymore, it was pretty terrifying. Also because you couldn't orientate yourself anymore on the battlefield, covered in dust and all the confusion the chaos that a battle can produce, right? And together with banners as well, as we have seen. Looking at northeast Africa, in the area of Sudan and the African Horn, in the 14th century, Ibn Battuta, another famous historian, was at Mogadishu, in the eastern Sudan at this time, and heard of the tabul-khana of the local sultan, which comprised reed pipes, horns, trumpets, and drums. At Mali, instead, in western Sudan, that would be Mali, basically, the sultan's military band was made up of horns and drums, the former being made out of elephants' tusks. One of the last of the Sunni rulers of the Songhai of Gao, ruling between roughly the mid like the 30s of the 14th century to the end of the 15th. Ali died in 1492. Used a drum as a symbol of authority. Now it's interesting because we know, that in African traditions, kind of drums are kind of stereotypical, if you want. So it's very interesting to see how this local cultures that were originally pagan and being converted to Islam at this point were structuring their own power by using kind of part of instruments of their own local tradition that now, however, we're assuming a greater importance. For example, the successors of the Songhai, the Askia kings ruling between 1493 and 1590, also used the drum, and under the Askia al-Ajiji Muhammad, troops were assembled in 1493 to the beating of the drum. So you see, also in these areas that are relatively peripheral and still, not having terrifically structured political and military structure, you see that the beating of the drum was a thing, also because firearms were spreading there as well, and they would require, now we are in the full modern age, so linear tactics is yet to be developed even in Europe, but the idea that you need a higher training, at least for musketeers, for arquebusiers, into certain types of infantry is important. This is important that these instruments, in fact, are used militarily speaking, right? And in 1501, a large trumpet called the kakaki was adopted by the Songhai cavalry, interesting enough. And this is very interesting, especially because of that video I made at our time about the difference between, the trumpet is a bit more, in fact, for cavalry, for it hits more on the tympana, and it gives the cavalryman just this spur to go to assault, right? And while the drum is more for infantry, right? So here it's fascinating. Songhai cavalry started using trumpet as well. The areas of the savannas, some of the, between, let's say, tropical Africa and the Sahara, there is this big stripe of the savannas that actually saw, historically speaking, since the middle, but actually even since before, an astonishing development of cavalries, right? It was a big deal. Cattle raiding and stuff, entailed a pretty developed use of cavalries that, by the way, we know since having existed since the last century, that there is extensive, even photographic evidence of this beautiful cavalrymen in the region. If you've never gotten interested into that, I urge you to do it because it's fascinating. It's like taking a photograph of a medieval knight in this African context. And in the Askia, Muhammad Bun Khan died in 1537. Is said to have invented a horn himself called the futurifu. Yeah? There was also a drum known as the gabtanda, and both this and the futurifu were used at Gao, where the Portuguese, as you know, would arrive at one point. And he fixed the limit outside the town where no drum save the royal drum, the tabl al-sultan, in fact, the drum of the sultan, could be sounded. This is very fascinating as well, because here you see, as we saw that in medieval Syria, Mesopotamia, that even in this context, African context of the modern age, you find the idea that a certain instrument had to be sounded, and particularly a military instrument here in Islamic tradition, had to be sounded only within the town walls and not outside, right? So this band, it is particularly important because it means that what was outside belonged to the king, to the sultan, right? And it's an important territory, and I'm sure that this is not entirely devoid of pre-existing, actually, sacral religious traditions, where you know that certain instruments in even very primitive civilizations could be sounded only in certain places, certain sacred places, because these instruments were thought to be part of the, sort of voice of certain deities. And here, in this Black African context, you can imagine what the level of development here still was, and those beliefs had to be pretty strongly alive in many ways. Maybe surely the rest of the this, as it always happens, the elites were playing the monotheistic card. The rest of the people would still largely be pagan and keeping to believe, largely, even with pretty high levels of tolerance still at that point, their whatever that they had to, right? So, and interestingly enough, this royal drum would be in use until the end of the Askija dynasty. And on the Moroccan conquest of 1590 and the governorship of the pashas in the place of the native kings, a change came also in the martial music. For example, under Pasha Ahmad al-Khalifa between 1694-95, reed pipes, the giyat, the drums, atbal, and other instruments, including native tambourines, the dufuf al-azaki, were counted among the martial instruments of the Pasha's court. Also, the military music of the Bambara chiefs were horns and tambourines, and one chief had great horns as well, as tall as a man. So just imagine also what kind of sounds they could emit. So going back a little bit to the Middle East, at Il-Khanate times, we didn't talk much about the Il-Khanates and Schwerpunkt. At one point I made a video about Il-Khanate heavy cavalry, but that's all. But here, under the early Khans, the Mongol prince was allowed kettle drums and a drum, whilst a Wazir had a kettle drum instead. The commander-in-chief was given drums. An emir of a certain number of troops, perhaps 10,000 men, as well as tributary princes, were allowed basically a kettle drum. Also, Ibn Battuta gives a picturesque account of the military music of the Sultan Abd Said, died in 1355, at Baghdad, and consisting of drums and kettle drums, trumpets, horns, reed pipes, and singers as well. According to the author, the Umara had horns as well as drums, and each royal princess as well had a drum. The princesses are important, especially at the diplomatic level, so they have their own band of representatives, right? And they are introduced to this broad diplomatic scenario that is, I mean, diplomatic maybe is a big word, but you understand. I mean, this Abbasids and Abbasids, let's say better, and other international relations do require representation also for princesses. And these are the Il-Khanate princesses, so they're part of the same Mongolian dynasty that has ruled all over the world. So that's why they're so important, by the way. And the Il-Khan himself had a special monster kettle drum, not surprisingly, that expresses the size of Oceanic ruler. I mean, Oceanic ruler was the greater title even Genghis Khan could have. The Il-Khanates were a regional power. Still, they owned this idea of grandeur, of being the direct descendants, in fact, of the Mongol Oceanic rulers. And the name Ibn Battuta uses to define it is Tabl al-Kabir, which means in fact great drum. Although to the Mongols later it would be known as the kurga, right? And the kurga was the personal music emblem of the Il-Khan, and at this death it was destroyed, as Rashid al-Din, the historian of the Mongols, has related. And this is very important because it somewhat expresses that this instrument was a kind of a personification of the same ruler. And we will see eventually that in times of mourning, for example, it was also customary to refrain from sounding the nawba. This was an old practice, actually, which we find as early as the Caliph al-Muqtadi, who, when he lost his son Muhammad in 1087, forbade the bidding at the hours of prayer. Similarly, for example, Salah al-Din, having suffered a reverse at the end of the Crusaders, abandoned the nawba until he had won a victory. Now, this is particularly meaningful because it tells you how important this music was in both representing power, right? This is it would be interesting to confrontate this also with the development of the the mankins of the dead sovereigns into, for example, the English and the French monarchies at one point were developed. I mean, it's the idea, albeit here a bit more different, that there is a personification of power that lives, in this case, together with the human being, right? Or especially in the case of the Mongols, that definitely here had a great self, entitlement, that they felt themselves rightfully as they had conquered literally the known world. So the fact that an Il-Khanate ruler died, for example, was a big deal at the point that the same instrument, this giant drum, had to be destroyed at that point. It couldn't be rebuilt. This is very important because actually if you look at funeral practices of the steppes, and this was partly also present into the there was a difference between the Turkic or steppes tradition that actually the Turks and the Mongols shared and the Arab one. For example, during funerals, also for hygienic reasons in much hotter climates, there were very few lamentations in Arabia. Like, the funeral was done very early and very speedily, and there was this idea that there had to be a soon forgetting all of this. Also for other reasons, because society was less stratified in some part. In the steppes instead, and this is something that the Ottomans inherited from that background specifically, even if they were pretty detached from that, but it still was a model of power that was handed down to generations as a legacy. There was a huge, the death of the chieftain was a huge tragedy. Like, women tore their hair off and cried so loud, so publicly, etc. Because the death of a chieftain at that point was the death of the great commander, in the virtue of which this oceanic masses of cavalrymen had achieved victory against others, and therefore his death now meant that future trouble, because this world system would crumble and a lot of people would die in turn, etc. So it's very meaningful. I think the Il-Khanate example of the instrument that gets destroyed, right? And it's interesting to parallel it with the one of Salah ad-Din, that instead, being defeated by the Crusaders, doesn't destroy the instrument. He is still alive, but he doesn't play the music, and especially he promises not to play it again up to the point in which he will regain a victory against the Crusades. This was a way, was voting oneself, right, to and it's difficult to me anthropologically to mean what this silence meant. at that point. It's naturally a sort of an absence. It definitely it's a look to those event for which it's as if there had been a loss that could not be replaced. This is, I think, the meaning of it. But the continuity of the Nakkara-Khana is there, right? And it lives on in that kind of caliphal context that the Il-Khanates, for example, instead didn't share. But this idea of suspending the music, the military music, and remember always that this is a military music. This is not other type of music. So it's as if these powers had been all based about this faculty of power. This is dramatically close to what the imperium into the Roman Empire in Christian in the Christian Middle Ages is about. This is a faculty of power that is about waging war, literally. So there are about the Timurid period. For example, in Persia, according to the apocryphal Tutzukat, that means the institutes, the military band was carefully regulated as well, so it was a great attention towards that, and this possibly has to do with, a closer, the Timurids largely coming originally from the steppes military culture, giving more importance to the drums, to the Nakkara-Khana, as for strictly military use, right? Where this huge masses of men, Timur the Lame rebuilt an empire. We made several videos about the Timurids. This point, had an enormous amount of men under his command. So it's obvious that the military bands had to be much more carefully regulated, kind of smaller provincial rulers, right? For example, a begler bag, there was all a hierarchy. A begler bag had a kettle drum and a horn, while the Amir al-Umara and an Amir of the four-tailed Tuk had a kettle drum only. Then a Ming Pasha had a trumpet, and a Ayybudis Pasha had an On Pasha had a drum, whilst a Noimak, that is a tribal chief, had only a horn. That is very meaningful, right? So you pass from the big band to just the tribal, that is the commander of the bigger armies, to the tribal chief that has only a horn. Passing to Islamic India. Now, the Mughals maintained the Nakkara-Khan as one of their attributes of sovereignty. And Ibn Battuta, though, points out that when he visited the Medinan Sharif when the Medinan Sharif Abu Ghurra visited India, he caused great consternation by his use of drums and trumpets, because here, unlike Iraq, Egypt, or Syria, nobody but the king could use the Nakkara-Khan. And this is very meaningful, because it tells you about the initial centralization of Mughal power, right? So the lesser and how highly actually this Mongol culture now, at least the descendant of Mongol cultures, but definitely very, even several local influences from between the Turks, Persia, etc., had, however, interiorized the sacrality of the nawba, right? And how this was considered, in fact, a diplomatic incident at the same time. Al-Umari, that died in 1349, in his Mazalik al-Absar, speaks of the five-fold nawba of the Sultan of Delhi being played by 200 pairs of kettle drums, 40 pairs of great kettle drums, 20 horns, and 10 pairs of cymbals, right? Which is definitely an impressive display. The Nakkara-Khana of Akbar the Great, died in 1605, is described by Abu al-Fadl al-Lami as made up of the monster kettle drum called the kubarga or kurga, which was about 18 pairs, then the kettle drum or nakkara, about 20 pairs, the drum of duhul, 4, the reed pipe or surna, 9, that were both of Indian and Persian types, the large trumpet known as the karana or karna, 4 or more of them, the trumpet or nafir, that could be actually of Indian, Persian, and at this point, however, also of European types, because Europeans, of course, were expanding in India as well at that point, and the horn or sing in number of 2, and the cymbals or sinj in 3 pairs. A description of the nawba in Mughal India is also given in this latter work. By this time, kettle drums were sometimes conferred on high civil or military functionaries, but the latter had to be of the rank of 2,000 suvars at least, and they could not be sounded in the presence of the emperor, nor within a certain distance from his residence. Right. So this is important because it tells you that there had been a central control of how these instruments were used, and so that no other political authority could abuse of them, right? And here it implicitly speaks about the importance of the emperor's residence in itself as the place where such military music had to be normally played. And also, in conferring this privilege, the recipient had miniature drums placed around his neck, so that this, nawba could be stilized by simply, these little drums that, however, as we have seen, were central in this tradition since millennia, and that certified in the sense that the guy had received that special privileges. Passing to the Ottomans now. So the Ottomans, as we've recalled before, are famous because of their precocious use of, in fact, military instruments, musical military instruments, that also impressed the Europeans pretty much. Consider that during the Crusades, actually the Franks had been acquainted with some surprise with all this kind of musical background, and evidently into the West was not present. And objectively, as I said at the beginning of the video, there is not at least an enormous amount of evidence for such a colored military musical background, let's say, into the West that is comparable to the Middle Eastern tradition. And this is important also because probably it says that Western warfare was kind of less dynamic, at least initially speaking. In terms also, the Western knights were all about this frontal charge, and that, that you just need one, one signal. Instead, like the Muslims fought with mostly Turkic tactics, doing back and forth continuously. All this musical coordination on the battlefield was fundamental for their tactical achievements. So it's they are two different cultures that in some ways they also were pretty similar to each other, but still from a musical point of view, seemingly the Muslim one was more developed. Now, as we were also recalling before, until comparatively recent times, the Turks made a special feature of their military music, which, just like the Mongols, they linked up with insignia of flags, banners, and tuks, as we defined them previously. This is important, actually, because I even made a playlist on Ottoman history, and I tried to explain how Objectively, the Ottomans, since the very beginning, were massively influenced by Western culture at the very beginning of there, but still they were very open, very clever at absorbing all the various political forms of legitimization, and part of them, they would feel that they would proclaim themselves as continuers of the Roman Empire, all the thing you can imagine, put together. This is what the Ottomans did. And however, among one of the major influences, aside from the Turkish one, there was the Mongol one, right? The Turks and the Mongols that did share the steppe for quite a long time, together in the west with the Indo-Iranians. And they shared certain models that you can see even linguistically in certain titles of power. Speaking about the Khan, the Khanate, the Khaganate, etc. Because the Turks back in the day had recognized actually the might of the Mongol Empire, but remaining very impressed by that. Since they spoke their own same political language, they felt themselves to be extremely reverent towards even the heirs of the Mongol Empire. Like the Ottomans, as you know, expanded far even into the Black Sea, and they crushed the Crimean Khanate at one point, or at least they kind of absorbed it and waged war on it, and they also, they were in this continuous relation with the Khans of the Golden Horde, but formally they always revered the symbol of their political authority as successors of the Mongols. So it is very interesting to see in this visual and acoustic tradition how the Mongol legacy, or maybe the fact that simply the Turkish legacy was pretty linked up to the Mongol one, and how it was recognized. So when Othman the first, the founder of the dynasty, was made a prince by the Seljuk Sultan of Rome, Almohads, in 1289, he was invested with a drum, flag, and toga. Right. So this is pretty meaningful in itself, and that is the foundation of the Ottoman Principate as such. And at the ceremony, absolute silence was insisted on during the performance of the nawba, as in the full Islamic tradition here. The large kettle drums called kuzat were used in the time of Ottoman I, died in 1324, when they were carried by elephants on some occasions. Celebi, writing in the 17th century, mentioning this latter episode, gives a few details of the military music of the 17th century in itself. Murad IV died in 1640, introduced the large trumpet called the karna from Persia. As a matter of fact, military music was regularly organized during this century, and the Ottoman bands comprised the large reed pipe or kaba zurna, the small reed pipe or dura zurna, the flute or ney, the big drum or kaba duhul, the ordinary drum or duhul, the great kettle drum or kus, the kettle drum or nakkara, the cymbal or zil, and the so-called jingling Johnny, the tsagana or chagana, actually, I think it's pronounced. And the Sultan military bands also comprised 62 players under the command of an officer, and also there is evidence of janissaries headed by reed pipes and kettle drums. And for later on, but now we're exceeding into the modern age. So going back in a certain sense to the origins of in Persia, right? And the strictly local Iranian military musical culture. So before the rise of the Il-Khanates, that as you know are kind of the outsiders, and they're in a otherwise very fragmented region that would come back to be fragmented. You know, the Il-Khanate power wouldn't last. I mean, it would last long enough, but it was kind of following the disgregation tendentially over time. And we find the Nakkara-Khana and the nawba in, of course, as their land of origin in some sense in the Middle East. Al-Din, the Ghurid, died in 1204, had great kettle drums of gold, which were carried on a chariot. So think about the importance. You see here in this Iranian dimension how even more glorious was the role and the symbology of these instruments. Made of gold and carried by a chariot, which is as if they were embodying by themselves the connection with the divinity. You know, the chariot of glory brings to the skies. You know, and this is even, you know, his was a fully Muslim culture now, but this was a pagan symbology. Let's be honest about it, and it came straight from, you know, even certain, you know, ideas. I won't say Neoplatonic, but in fact, you know, in Plato there is that. In Shia Islam, there is the myth of the chariot with it goes to the skies, and the sense of victory. And in the Shia Islam was massively influenced by Neoplatonism as well. So that could be a link telling the truth. Jalal al-Din Mingburnu died in 1231. It was the last Shah of the Khwarezmian Empire. Had his nawba performed on 27 drums of gold encrusted with precious stones, the players being sons of subject rulers. Just think this is the imperial, you know, Indo-Iranian idea of the celestial deity of the skies. No more nor less. Here you have the nawba played on 27 drums of gold encrusted with precious stones, and those who have to play them are sons of those rulers who have been subjected. Right? So it's as if this recalls telling the truth, because it's as if now, as these drums were like not operated passively by this subject, the sons of these subject rulers, but it's as if the drums were played for were, I can't say they were playing the players, but that by this play they would sound for the great vanquisher of, you know, of the Khwarezm emperor, right? That he was. I mean, so in other words, this recalls what we have seen also for the monster drum of the Il-Khanate that was destroyed at the death of the Khan, right? So it's as if the glory here, it's as if this subject rulers played the sacred music to, I mean, for the ruler. So it's as if the ruler embodied in some way this glory, this divine glory. So it's as if he was all one. Obviously, there was always the separation between the divine glory that was spiritual and the man that was, you know, of course, earthly and mortal. But still, this greatness attributed to the instrument and to the music and to the ruler, right, is an all one. Like it's all among it, and this is terrific if you know the Neoplatonic symbolism of Mazdaism and the political and religious culture of Shia Islam, right? And these are traditions that date back as far as Zoroastrianism, right? And they stress this sacralization of the one who is at the top, and in an extremely spiritual and subtle, more sophisticated way, also philosophically, theologically speaking. This is very, very important. Interestingly enough, in the International Exhibition of Persian Art in London in 1931, were exhibited a fine pair of bronze kettle drums from Dagestan that were probably of Persian manufacture, that can be very, similar to these ones of gold that we do not own, right? But unfortunately, they were not cataloged, so they were probably datable to the 12th, 13th centuries, right? So it was exactly those times, and it would have been terrific to know how they were, and who knows where they are, honestly. It would be interesting to research this instrument. So Persian art also is full of representations of military bands. We could talk about the development of the Nakkara-Khan under the Safavids and the Qajars, for example, and also about the Pahlavi period. But this is I don't know much about this. I didn't prepare myself, and it's about modern and contemporary times. So it's very important to think that these musical traditions survived very, very late in time. Like today's Muslim countries' military music is actually all Western derived, because at one point in the 19th century all of these powers started to copy, like others in the world, the European, the Western military. Part of these traditions have been lost, but some haven't. As we were saying before, in the Turkish armies, that there is still this kind of thing going on, and they're very, nationalism. The other day, I think Erdogan was claiming something that, let's hope that our soldiers going in Libya, they will replicate the deeds of Barbarossa in the 16th century. And that's the kind of mindset that, maybe not in the right way, but it still preserves at least some memory of the past. And you can see in that military tradition there is still, these drummers, etc. But that also comes from a later development of the Ottoman military, so it doesn't tell us clearly much about even early medieval times, I suppose. But you can imagine even medieval times in here. So I think that this is very fascinating, this has changed the face of Islamic military music, military bands. The interesting thing, though, is that what pertains, I think, to Westerners today, because basically in the Middle Ages, Europe borrowed a lot from this Islamic military tradition. As we've seen, the nakkara-khana were indispensable in the military discipline, exercise, and tactics of the Muslim armies, and in the West we found that out the hard way during the Crusades, right? When we confronted with this world that was, relatively far, maybe not so much actually, maybe not at all, but it was still a different culture and a different musical tradition. Europe, however, was mostly to be exposed to this military tradition during the wars against the Ottomans. There are all traditions that could be traced in here, but we don't talk about it in this video. But just for example, think about etymologically speaking. It seems that the West borrowed many of the same terms. The nakkara is to be found in the German nakkar, in the French nakker, in the Italian nakkara, and the table as the table, tabor, etc. The timbal as the timbale, the casa as the kes, the book as the albok, the alnafir as the anafil, whilst such terms as the fanfare, for example, and taket may possibly be derived from amphar and tuka, respectively. And even the percussion instruments in the modern military bands of Europe were adopted from the Ottomans in the early 18th century, which I find very, very meaningful. Also because the 18th century was a moment in which European warfare was basically re-increasing, for example, first of all, the need for drums, but also for cavalry and trumpets, right? And so, as you know, Ottoman cavalry, especially light cavalry, was more readily available, also in certain, actually Christian Balkanic countries. In the local musical traditions. I mean, so it would be very, very fascinating actually to study the military culture of the Balkans, to find out whether this local Christian communities under and outside the Ottoman Empire had developed something similar. What are the musical influences? Because some of them are objectively still today. You can see certain Balkanic music pretty close even to the Turkish one. In some, I mean, at least there are influences, as you can imagine. And in fact, when these instruments were adopted at the time, in orchestral, that is string band music, they were for a long time called Turkish music in Europe. And there was an obsession, by the way, in 17th or 16th, 18th, even in 18th century Europe, for Ottoman military culture. I mean, in the 17th century, especially in Central Europe, like the most prized gift that a prince could make to another was a full Ottoman armor, because in the West, they were, especially in German country area, let's say Central Europe, they were literally obsessed with Turkish things. The 18th century was mostly the obsession with the chinoiserie, with China. So the West definitely owes a lot, even in this musical tradition, to what this specific Islamic military music import. And because that's when the West and the East met most of the times in war, at that point in history, so it's not a surprise, right? The English jingling Johnny that we mentioned before, in French the chapeau chinois, or in German the Schellenbaum, with its horse tails, carries also a relic of the Turkish name Chagana, right? It would be like the Johnny. And it's fascinating because that was all one with the musical thing and the banner, even with the crescent. There are some beautiful pictures that I've put also in this video that shows you this banner with the crescent. It was something as old, like I think the Sumerians, that eventually were adopted by the Byzantines, and then by the Muslims. And that's one of the most. There is in Christian symbology even the Virgin standing on the crescent. There's all the symbology attached, something that date back to Neolithic cultures, agricultural religions and cults, let's say better. And so it's eventually the Jingling Johnny was superseded by the portable Glockenspiel, right? And the fanfares of European military bands may very well be survivals of medieval Oriental practice, right? So if you want to, find what it kind of was like, unfortunately we can't directly, but we can assess that at least part of what we have and part of what we are is also thanks to these traditions and dating back from the medieval Islam specifically. So I think that this thing is very fascinating. Actually, if you want to read this, I already told, this is from there is a pretty extensive voice at the term tabul-khana in volume 10 of the Encyclopedia of Islam, from pages 34 to 38. It's pretty hefty, fairly hefty text. Today I quoted extensively from it, so yeah, I hope it's fine, but I added my own considerations because certain things are. This is mostly the data, the criticism is I try to add as much as I could but it tells you so much, which is astonishing. When I was reading this, I was like, wow, I never thought about this part of music, of the history of music, of political military culture before. And I find it amazing, and this is just a synthesis, as you imagine. So there is actually an extensive amount of material in this stuff. It would be very, very interesting to dig in, and who knows, maybe one day we will do it. But I personally found it very fun and very interesting to learn, and I hope that was interesting for you as well. So for now, we'll stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.